Hello, hello, Stan, how are you?
Good, Jen, good. How are you?
All good, all good. And I've been enjoying watching myself for last two episodes and expecting again to see new one from you and us. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have another episode ready today, Jen, and today we'll be continuing our security discussion around OIC and specifically looking at how to secure OIC endpoints or APIs, if you will, with OAuth.
Oh, okay. So sounds like little bit getting deeper, OAuth, right?
Yes, exactly. Last session was around IP allow listing, and today we'll be talking about OAuth. Yep.
So what kind of use case do you think this will be useful?
I think we'll introduce some high-level concepts initially, but the main use case will be to allow different clients to access a subset of your OIC APIs. So for example, if you have a client and you only want to give them access to 1 or 2 or 3 integrations, then this is exactly what we'll address that. So effectively, having that finer course control of giving clients access to some APIs, but not all.
Okay, so I'm sure we've been hearing from the OIC users about how can I protect access to this API A, but allow them to access B. So those kind of requirements can be met, right?
Exactly, yeah. As you said, we get that request fairly frequently, right? Where customers would say, hey, I've created an API in OIC, but I only want this one client to have access to it.
Okay. Do we need any extra tooling to make that happen, or the Oracle Cloud and OIC is enough?
You do. So what you'll see today is that we're using, what used to be called Oracle IDCS, which is our authorization server. It's now, I guess, called OCI IAM. So you do need an authorization server, and you do need, in this case, we'll be using an API gateway as well.
Okay.
OCI API gateway.
So we got everything from Oracle Cloud.
We do.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Let me share my screen. So really what we're going to start with is just a couple of slides that introduce what we see around how people are implementing OAuth for OIC. This first pattern is its very most basics, architecture, where you have your OIC instance that contains your integration where you've implemented your API, and each OIC instance is tied to an IDCS instance, and in that IDCS instance, you would create an application which would be supporting the client credential flow, and it would have access to the OIC scopes. So it would basically provide external clients the ability to call OIC integrations using client credential. Now, one important thing that we should actually mention is that all of these flows are based on machine to machine or the client credential flow. We're not talking about any user context in any of this. So in this case, what you do is you just set up one application in IDCS, and that application would be exposing the OIC resources and providing your clients with the client ID and client secret that they need to be able to get a token and use that token to call OIC, and OIC in turn would validate that token and allow access to those APIs. Okay,
so to do this, does user need to have like some sort of background for IDCS open authentication configuration, or?
Yeah, it is important to have a little bit of background, but this pattern specifically is, as I mentioned, the most simplest, and there's a lot of blogs out there that kind of describe how this should be done. In fact, if you actually search for OIC auth, you'll see one blog that talks about doing this with user context and another blog that talks about this using client credentials. So you can just follow those blogs and implement it, and that will guide you through what you need to do in IDCS. Okay, got it. Okay, let's go to the next one, which is just a slight variation of what we've seen here. So the next flow just introduces an API gateway into this equation, nothing more. And the same thing happens. So your client would hit IDCS. It would, retrieve a token back from IDCS, and then it would use that token to call OIC, same as before, except now instead of calling the OIC endpoint directly, it would call an API gateway endpoint, which would, from the OIC backend integration. In this case, in the gateway, you wouldn't implement any authentication. So you wouldn't do JWT validation necessarily, because all you're doing here really is just passing the token through to OIC, and OIC will actually validate that token. So as long as that token is issued by the corresponding IDCS instance that OIC is attached to, then OIC will happily validate it. And so this is another frequent deployment that we see being used out there. It's very simple too. Does that make sense, Jin? Shall we keep going?
Yep. There's one more, like the flows are there, but looks straight.
So this kind of brings us to this pattern, and this is really the pattern that we see mostly where customers are using an external authorization server. So whether that's Okta or Auth0, Curity, it doesn't really matter, but they're using an external authorization server. And so their API clients would go to that authorization server, they would retrieve the corresponding token, and they would call our gateway with that token. Now here, there's a couple of different approaches. In the OCI API gateway, we have a JWT validation policy that's directly configurable via the UI, so you can validate that token there. And for a lot of use cases, that's fine. However, when OIC is used as a backend to the OCI API gateway, OIC has to receive a token issued by its IDCS instance, or its corresponding IDCS instance. So hence why we can't just accept a token issued by any identity provider. And so in this particular flow, what we're really doing is a token exchange. We're taking a token issued by an external authorization server, and we're exchanging it for a token that's issued by the IDCS instance that's associated with OIC. And so this token exchange process kind of, has this implementation where the gateway receives the external token, external authorization server token, and calls an authorizer function. So this is a function that you create or you own, and we have a whole bunch of samples around these authorizing functions that you can use as a starting point. But in this case, the function will do two main things. One is it will validate the token, the external token, and two, it would exchange it for an IDCS token that OIC would accept, right? And so on the first part, the validation of the token, here you can see this depicted by the line with the number 4 associated with it. That can happen in one of two ways. It can either happen by calling an introspection endpoint on your authorization server. And a lot of the current OIC blogs that talk about using an external authorization server follow this flow, where the authorizer function would just call that introspection endpoint to validate the token. But the other way that you can do this is to actually just validate it locally, right? So without calling an introspection token, you would validate that locally. I'll speak about that more just in a second. But anyway, once that token is valid, then you would actually do the token exchange and go back to IDCS and actually exchange it for an IDCS issued token with the appropriate scopes for accessing OIC. So that's what step 5 is there. And we have OCI Vault in that picture, and that OCI Vault is really just storing the credentials that we use to access IDCS through this function. And so once we've exchanged the token, we've grabbed the IDCS token, then the API gateway will override the authorization header on the backend route to OIC. And then so OIC is always just receiving this token issued by IDCS.
Okay.
So that's the high level architecture for this. really, these are kind of the three things that we see most common with OIC usage out there.
So over here, function is a key component to like further orchestration and interaction with authorization server, yada yada yada, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
What kind of language is supported?
So Oracle Function supports a number of different languages: Java, Python. In this particular case, in my demo, I've implemented it in Python. But yeah, there's a whole bunch, and we can provide some links in the show notes. I guess for me, I'm used to Python, so that's all I use. So I don't know the full list of everything we support, but we can provide that in the show notes.
Very good to know. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so Jen, I wanted to kind of bring one slide together that talks about locally validating that external JWT token versus doing the token introspection endpoint.
Yeah.
And if I actually start right to left and talk about introspection endpoint first, so with the introspection endpoint in your function, it's pretty easy. All you do is you'd call the introspection endpoint of your authorization server. You'd pass in the token, and and you have to authenticate as part of that call. So most likely using some type of client ID secret there as well. But the point is that authorization server will actually tell you if the token is valid. And it will usually in this active element, it will tell you true or false, and it will do all the validation. Effectively, what you're doing is you're offloading all the token validation to the authorization server. Keeps your function simpler, right? Because you don't have any code in there to do any necessarily a lot of that. It's also more secure because you know that token is valid at that point that you've just checked with the authorization server. So you're really handling subsequent revocation use cases. However, the disadvantage with this approach is that it can add extra network traffic and additional latency. Because every time you call an API, if you're doing token introspection, you're going back to the authorization server and you're saying, hey, is this token valid? Right. So in a traditional use case, you can, that's almost like doubling up every call that you get. Now with the OCI API gateway, we have some caching around that basically means that whenever we validated a token, we're going to cache the response, usually for the TTL of the token, depending if how long that is actually. But so we're going to cache it for a bit so that for example, if I have a token that's valid for 1 hour, the gateway doesn't need to keep calling the introspection endpoint every time that it sees the same token provided to it. But if different clients are calling with different tokens, then obviously that will need to be validated. So the alternative approach is to just validate the JWT locally within your function. And there's a whole bunch of libraries out there for every language really that provide, they take the hard work out of validating a JWT away from you. But basically at a high level, you need to validate the JWT signature and the claims within the JWT, right? So the issuer, the audience, is the token within the expiration date, etc., etc. So you do that within your function. Now the advantage of the JWT local validation is that it's fast and there's no extra network hop, no latency, etc. But really what that does is that only ensures that the token is valid when it was issued. So it doesn't handle subsequent revocation use cases. So if I issue a token, I give it to this client, the token might have an hour to live. I could subsequently revoke the client in the authorization server. But if you're doing local validation, as long as the token is active, you're still going to pass it through to your backend. So it's important to just kind of be aware of that if you're going down that path.
But can you tell me when to use like introspection endpoint and when to use like JWT local validation? There should be like right use case.
Yeah. So personally, my opinion is that you should use JWT local validation for anything that's high frequency. So anything where the gateway is getting a lot of calls, especially if it's getting calls from different clients. And introspection I would use for APIs that you really need to be sure that the token is currently valid for. So maybe like a payment API or something where you can't just you need to actually go make sure the token's valid at that particular point in time.
Okay, that's great.
Yep. All right, so the next thing that we wanted to talk about, Jen, is the ability to kind of put this to use. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, one of the common asks is how can I control access to APIs? And really what we're going to show here is that we can do that via scope claims within the JWT token. And so basically we can have this scenario where we have two different APIs, and we want to make sure that only appropriate clients have access to a specific API.
Okay, so that term you use, scope, is particularly related to the open authentication management, right?
Yeah, it's part of the JWT token.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so for the demo for this, we're going to kind of see this, and so we're going to have two clients and an external authorization server. So each client set up in such a way that they will call the external authorization server to get a token, and the token that they will get will have a specific a scope claim. So the first client's going to have access to the product API, or will get assigned a token with the product scope, and the second one will get a hello world scope. Once they retrieve their relevant token from the authorization server, they're going to call out gateway at the relative API endpoint. And the gateway is going to call this this auth function that we've talked about. And this auth function is going to locally validate the JWT and then do a token exchange to the IDCS. And then call the backend service, which is hosted on OIC. Now, this is I'm going to show a couple of different ways that people can do this. So in this particular case, I have one auth function, but I've actually replicated it twice because in each implementation, I want to validate a different scope. And that is, the product API has to have the product scope, etc. So I've taken the same function and I've implemented twice with two different configs. Now you could use the same function with the same config but different parameters and then do conditional statements within your function. Or there's another approach which is way neater and means you can only implement your function once, and I'll show that in a subsequent demo. So really I'm just kind of showing the different ways that you can actually do the implementation here. This is Auth0. Yeah, I'm using Auth0 as my external authorization server, and here I've created one API called integration demos. Now I could have and probably should have created two, one for products and one for hello world, but I guess that's there's a lot of different ways to kind of implement this. But in this API, I've defined a few different permissions. So you can see in here I've defined 3 different permissions. So one, which is integration hello world, which will be a scope claim. And another which is product.
So those are scopes will be part in the claim of JSON Web Token you explained.
Correct. And there's a third one. We won't touch the third one until the second demo, so I won't talk about that for now. And then what we've done is we've created 2 OIC clients. So OIC client 1 and OIC client 2, and each of these have access to a different to a different permission. So you can see OIC client 1 has got access to hello world integration, and OIC client 2 has got access to the product, just to the product one. So so that's the setup on the authorization server. Then on the IDCS side, we also have a simple application that we've configured there that would provide a client credentials flow for us to use, and it is scoped to allow me access to my OIC instance, right? So this is what we'll be using to call for the token exchange to get an IDCS issue token. So now let's go to the API gateway. And so here we have two deployments, one for the Hello World API, one for the product API. So if I go into the Hello World API, and we can have a look at the deployment. So from an authentication point of view, you can see here that we're using the custom authentication type with our custom auth function, and that we're expecting the authentication token to be provided in the authorization header.
Okay.
And then on the backend route, here we have just a static router used for testing, but also we have the OIC backend route, which is this one here. So this will give us the Hello World API echo response that is from OIC. Now, one interesting thing that we do here, Jen, is remember when we call OIC, we have to call it with the IDCS token.
Yep.
So in the request policy for this backend route, we have a header transformation that will override the authorization header with the response from the token exchange back from IDCS.
Okay.
So that's all we have at the gateway. Now, if I show you the function, and really what I'm more wanting to show you here is just my config for this function. So I have a function, I'll show you the function in a second, but in here I keep all my config variables, which will hold things like the audience I want to validate, the scope that I want to validate, and a whole bunch of other stuff like my IDCS endpoint that I want to call. One thing to kind of bring your attention to is, you see my IDCS client secret. So instead of actually putting in my password in this way, my password's actually stored in OCI Vault, and my function actually will fetch it. Here, just have a reference to it. So at runtime, we'll actually go and fetch the actual value from OCI Vault. So it's nice and secure. Okay, so that's that. And then really just this is my function.
Yep.
So it does a number of things.
It is Python. Yeah.
It is Python. So it sets some context based on those parameters we just saw, right? So it grabs all those context variables. And then really the meat of the work is that it validates the token. It does a couple of things. So first, it calls the remote WKS endpoint within auth0. It gets the public key. It verifies the signature of the token, and then it verifies things like the audience, the issuer, the expiry timestamp, etc. And in here, we'll do all the validation, check the scopes, and if the token is active, active, then it's going to actually exchange it for the IDCS token. So this is what we'll call the token exchange function, and the token exchange function will call IDCS to exchange it, grab it back. And then, we have a couple of things that we actually pass back. One of those things that we pass back up after the function is the actual backend token. So I won't get into it in any more depth. If anyone is actually interested in, we can always kind of provide, this code offline. Okay, so we have all the components. So maybe let's do a demo. If I bring up my Postman client, so the very first thing is client one. So OIC client one is the one that has access to the Hello World API.
Yeah.
Right. So first I would need to call my auth0 endpoint in this particular case to retrieve a token. Then I can call my API gateway. So now, before I do that, I actually want to call this endpoint with my old token, one that we used, maybe an hour or so ago.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that this kind of gives me back a 401. So the first time you call a function, Jin, as you know, would have to wait for function warm time. So it will take a little while the first time. Once it's warmed up, then this request will be a bit quicker. While that's running, I just also want to jump into the function log so hopefully we can actually see what's happening with this function that we're just calling.
That's very handy. You can check from log.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So here we go. This was exactly what we wanted. I called my hello world endpoint with an OAUTH token.
So what it means that token was already expired, so can't be reused.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm hoping that we can see through the logs here now. Okay. So let me just refresh this. It hasn't come through yet, Jen. So sometimes with the logs, they can take a couple of minutes to come through. But yes, we'll see once this does come through, we'll see that the function is thrown out a message saying that the token is expired, and hence why we've got a 401 in that particular case. I'll just give it no, I'm still waiting for the logs. That's okay. Let me come back to that. So now maybe let me go and get a new token. And I'm going to now call the Hello World API with the new token. And I get a successful response, right? Which is exactly what we were expecting. So that's the client that had the scope to call the Hello World API is now able to call the Hello World API. Let me go back in here and just see if we got that log from before for the old request. Yeah, so so you can see in the last invocation, the token was successfully validated. And if I go back, see here, token expired.
Okay. Expired, signature has expired. That's good.
Yeah, so we have the complete log of what's happening with all of this, and we can actually see, right, and troubleshoot, which is nice. All right, so we called that endpoint with the Hello World API. Now, if I go back to Postman, I also have OIC Client 2, which has got access to call the product API, right? To do a get on the product API. Now, here I need to adopt, OIC Client 2, call the authorization server again, and get that relevant token. Right? So let me do that. Okay, so here I have the token that I need to use for the next call. Yeah, but Jen, what happens if we try and access the product API as client 1? So as client one has only got access to the Hello World API.
Yeah, Hello World only. Yeah.
So using that client, we shouldn't be able to access the product API. So let's see. Yeah. Here we go. We get a 401. And now if I waited for those logs to be refreshed this time, I'll get a different error saying that I don't have the required scope.
Awesome.
So now let me go back to this and copy this token, which is issued to client 2, which does have access to the product API, and pop it in here. And this should return, and it does. Nice. So really what we've been able to show is that you can secure APIs using this approach and basically control which clients can access which API.
So what you show me is the application, the integration application from OIC is staying there as it is, but you injected some what you call scope to control access to that API from the authentication server, external one, which is.
Yeah, exactly. The authentication server is passing that scope that we specified for the client into the token, and the function is validating that before the API can be accessed, that scope is present.
So what it means, if there's another new client, a little bit different requirement, then that can be implemented from external authorization server. And again, OIC endpoint application stay there.
Yeah, with nothing changes on our side. Yeah, we just create a new client as long as it has the right scope and all the other claims within that token. Hey, okay, we don't need to do anything. But what about this scenario? So what about, take the orders API again. we've just shown that you can restrict it to a certain client. But what if the orders API has lots of different methods and we want to restrict at the method level? So I want to have one client that I want to get access to and another client. So how do we do this? So in the second part of this demo, we can show how we can achieve this. So yeah, so what we'll do here is we'll do this whole validation using the exact same setup that we had in the first demo. The only thing that we're going to change is a routing policy at the gateway.
Oh, right? Sounds like you're not programming, you're just manipulating some configuration, right?
Yep, one config parameter at the gateway, and we're going to create a new client at the authorization server to demonstrate this. So the cool thing is here we don't need to change our function. We don't need to, and probably the most important thing, Jen, because I know we've been down this path before, is we don't need to implement any code in OIC to actually validate these claims in each route. So that's kind of nice. All right, so let me go back to here, and remember how before I said that there's one other client, which is OIC Client 3. Now, OIC, so this particular client, Jen, has got access to, again, the integration demo API, but this time it actually has access to two different scopes. It has access to the integration product scope, which lets you read, gives you read access, and also to the create scope, which gives you access to create resources. So we're going to use this client to try and actually hit a post request for the product API. So this you would use a different client ID, different client secret. Now at the gateway, let me go back to the gateway, and we need to go into the product deployment. So let me just go here, product API. And I'll just edit the deployment. So this deployment is exactly what we saw in the first demo. Except it has one change, one difference. And that difference is that you see what we did in the first demo is we hit this get request using this. Using the second client. So this time we're going to hit a post method. And for this, we've set up this extra bit of config, as you said, which is in the authorization parameter. We've actually said that we want to make sure that it validates an additional scope.
I saw that. I saw that.
So here, before it actually hits the backend, it's going to make sure that the request carries the scope, and if it doesn't, it's not going to let it go through.
That's very good. We just need to add that scope from the external authorization server for that method.
Yeah, and the cool thing is, you can use this approach to ensure that you don't deploy multiple functions, as I did in my first demo. Right, because then your function, you don't need a different implementation of your function every time you need to validate a different scope. You can do it through the gateway. Cool. Okay, so let's go into Postman one last time, and in here we have OIC Client 3, which has access to this scope that we want. So I will get a new token. And you can see actually even through here, Jen, that we actually now will carry the integration product create scope that we're
scope is different.
And so now if I go to the products API, this time we'll do a post. There's a body here of the message that we're sending. What I need to do is just pass in the new token and send. And so this will happen. The same thing happens here, right? We do the token exchange, we validate the original token, we make sure that the original token is valid locally. Then we exchange it for an IDCS token, but we still propagate this extra scope. Gateway validates the scope, passes it to the backend. Backend returns a 200.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, so That's it. That's what we really wanted to show, right, Jen, in this demo. And we hope that it's been a useful little video to show you how to control access to APIs that you expose through OIC.
I remember a lot of requests about how the end user of Oracle integration, how they can do fine-grained control to API without actually manipulating the OIC side. And I think the way you present exactly, I think, catered that requirement.
Yeah, exactly. It does, and we want that validation to happen at the gateway, right? And again, if you recall to our previous session, Jin and I think we're both very strong believers of having a gateway there for APIs that you want to expose externally, not just exposing them directly through OIC, because you have this extra layer of control and and the facade pattern that we spoke about last week. So I think that's all, very important. The one last thing actually that we wanted to mention, Jen, is that you don't have to use an external authorization server to do what we've just done. You can do the whole flow with using IDCS alone, right? You'd create a few more applications in there, a resource application, another client application, and there's a good blog post on this as well that we can provide in our show notes. But for customers out there that are solely using Oracle IDCS, you can do the exact same thing with that too.
Okay. But I think you proved that based on the REST API to the open authentication, no matter external authorization server or IDCS, it doesn't matter, and then it will work. But still, we need IDCS for the OIC integration authentication.
Yep, exactly. So with either approach, you need to do a token exchange.
Okay. This is another brilliant lesson for me and then audience. So I think well done, Stan, again. And now I can explain to people asking me about how you contribute open authentication for fine-grained access control to OIC API.
Hopefully we've helped someone out there with this video.
Okay, that's very good. Well done, Stan, and thanks for your time. And
thanks, Jen. Pleasure as always. Looking forward to our next session.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.